Hello, how you doing? I'm Anthony Balzano, professor of anthropology and sociology at Sussex County Community College. And you can contact me with any questions about this recording at abalzano at sussex.edu. And Sussex County Community College is in Newton, New Jersey. And today, what we're going to do is cover the chapter 3 from our textbook for fall 2024, The Human Story, An Introduction to Anthropology by Alexandra Brewis and 4 other authors. And so chapter 3 is on human variation, and we want to talk through that today. Now, is there any other information I need to give you? No, just that this is Anthropology 101, okay? And so we know that. And so chapter 3 is on human variation. Homo sapiens come in lots of different shapes, colors, disease tendencies, adaptations, and we want to talk through those. Now, the first part of this chapter sounds a lot like a biology course because what we're doing here is we have to start with DNA. Okay, we have to start with genetics to look at some basic concepts about genes because it's going to help us understand a lot about human variation. Now, I think the first thing we need to know about what DNA does, most importantly, it does one thing, and that is it codes for protein. Now, what your textbook goes into is lots of details about the structure of DNA with 4 different kinds of bases, okay, that are put together that create a code, and there's only 4 different kind of bases: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, and they are put together, and that's all you need to make up almost an infinite array of different sequences of genes. And you get any 3 of those pairs, and they pair up like adenine pairs up with thymine, cytosine pairs up with guanine, and 3 of those pairs together is what constitutes a gene. Um, there's 2 important processes of what genes go through. Okay, they sit on all of these chromosomes, and in Homo sapiens we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, and chromosomes has nothing to do with the complexity of the organism. And so potatoes, for example, have more chromosomes than Homo sapiens. How is that possible? Is possible because when we look at the structure of genes and how they interact with each other, that's what matters. Okay, and so potato chromosomes and the genes that are on their chromosomes don't interact very much with each other, but it matters a lot to Homo sapien chromosomes. So we have fewer chromosomes, but we have much more complex interactions between all of those genes. Now, there's 2 important things that happen when chromosomes exist in cells that matter a lot to us. One is mitosis, and that's just simply how the cells of our body reproduce themselves, okay, through a process of splitting the chromosomes apart and then creating 2 daughter cells, and then carrying on. So liver cells will break apart, and then they will replicate with how they break apart. Okay, they split in half, and then new halves are created and new cells are created. Now, when that happens, it doesn't always happen perfectly. Okay, it may be some mistakes, and that happens often, and you can get sometimes a mutation like that, or the organism could be really hurt by not having mitosis go properly. But for our purposes, we want to spend a little bit more time looking at another processes that cells go through, and that is meiosis. And there's only one kind of cell that goes through meiosis, and those are sex cells that create eggs and sperm. What happens with them is they break apart and then they break apart again. Okay, and so what happens when they break apart and then create another little cell, and then they break apart again and create another little cell, they create 4 what we call daughter cells, but those are sex cells, and those sex cells only carry 1/2 of the code of that of that individual. Now, because it's splitting twice, there's even more possibility that it may not, that it's going to come out a little bit differently. And the other thing that happens during meiosis is this process called crossing over. So what the genes do, what the chromosomes do when they split apart during meiosis is sections of the one chromosome will cross over to get onto another chromosome. Okay, and that's the way in which every sex cell becomes unique. Okay, that's why we as individuals are genetically unique because of what happens during meiosis and processing and creating sex cells. And what that does is it creates sex cells that have unique genomes. Okay, that is the genetic code that the cell carries. And when they come together during fertilization, it creates an entirely unique phenotype. And that is what you're looking at when you look at an individual is you're looking at the phenotype. You're looking at my phenotype right now. You're not looking at my genotype. That's hidden in my cells because not every gene that you carry gets expressed. You can pass it on to your offspring and you could inherit them from your parents, but you may never express them. And so all of that genetic material you have is your genome, and the genes that get expressed are your phenotype. Okay, now let's look at the rest of this chapter. Deals with human variation. Why are humans so different within a population? Okay, even within a population, every individual is unique. And then as we go from one population to the next, there's different kind of adaptations and different kind of phenotypes that become more dominant in one population than in another population, etc. And the best way to explain this in our book, the Brewis textbook, does a really interesting way of explaining. I think it's one of the better ways, and I've been doing this for many decades, okay, is they introduced the concepts of macroevolution and microevolution, okay? Now, macroevolution is what happens over a really long period of time. When we get into the next chapter on primates and the next chapter after that on human evolution, we're going to be talking about macroevolution. Like the first primate we know is about 60 million years old, okay? And we don't see anything that walks on two legs, that is human ancestors, until around 7 or 8 million years. So when you look at those kinds of millions of years, 50 to 6 or 7 million years, that's macroevolution, okay? Now, humans have not been around all that long, right? Humans have been around, Homo sapien, anatomically modern humans like us have been around about 200,000 years. That's 0.2 million years. But during that period of time, the 200,000 years, we've created, what's been happening is humans have evolved into looking very, very different from one another. Not very, very different, but tall, short, light skin, dark skin, adapting to lactose, adapting to malaria, lots of little changes like that. And those are examples of microevolution. So microevolution is something that happens in a much shorter time frame. Okay. Now, one example of macroevolution is natural selection, and your book talks about natural selection. And then we'll get on to micro. So one example of macroevolution is natural selection. And that's the way the environment will give, there are certain phenotypes that will be more favorable than other phenotypes depending on the environment. And the ones that are treated more favorably to an environment are the ones that survive. And that's natural selection. And species can change through natural selection. Another kind of macroevolutionary change is mutation. A lot of them may happen during mitosis or meiosis, and the ones that create more favorable survival rates will survive, and the other ones that won't, and that's another way in which populations and species would change. Another one is gene flow, another major way in which species change. And gene flow is when one population comes in contact with another population that it can breed with, and then that will change. They come together and they will have a lot of change from one generation to the next. Okay, and that's another way in which evolution could happen. And then the last kind of way in which evolution happens is through genetic drift. And genetic drift is when populations become really isolated and there are genes that are not normally expressed in the genome because the population is so small. They will then get expressed. Okay, that is, the genes drift to the surface, I'd like to say. And that's an example of genetic drift. It usually more commonly happens in small populations, but it could also happen through human culture and human behavior that sexually selects only certain type of people, and you can get genetic drift like that. And a lot of the variation we see from one population to the next is actually the consequence of sexual selection. And so only certain kinds of individuals will leave more offspring than the next. And then that trait that's selected for because of attractiveness will become more expressed. A good example of this would be, real stark example of this would be in the Sudan in northeastern Africa. Okay, there's a civil war going on there now as we speak. Okay, in the fall of 2024, but there are a lot of ethnicities in that part of the world that are very tall. They're very tall because of sexual selection. Okay, and their neighbors who are like right next door to them are not. They're like normal size, like people around the world are. So there's a lot of examples of sexual selection that lead to human variation. Okay, now that's because of cultural behavior. Another example, and by the way, that's also an example of this dovetails nicely into the concept we talked about before, microevolution. It's also an example of microevolution. Another example of microevolution and that has nothing to do with cultural behavior would be body shape. Now, what we know is that populations that live at very high altitudes, we're talking about over 10,000 feet, like in the Andes Mountains, okay, and in the Himalayas and Tibet, okay, two places where there have been populations living for tens of thousands of years at very, very high altitudes. I've never been that high. I mean, I've been on a couple of mountains that were in Colorado that were maybe 8,000 feet, but I don't think I've ever been up to 10,000 feet. And when you get up there, if you are a lowlander like all of us are, you all get oxygen deprivation, okay? And you all suffer from hypoxia, all right? That is, your body's not getting enough oxygen, and you will feel faint-headed, and you will start to breathe a little bit heavier, so you can get more oxygen in. So what happens with folks who live at very, very high altitudes is they will have larger lung capacities. Okay, and they will be a little bit shorter. Okay, because their chests will be more barrel-chested, and they will be able to adapt to high altitudes where the oxygen is lower. Another example of how environment shapes body shape will be folks who live for again tens of thousands of years in very hot, dry climates like deserts. And they will have a body shape that is much more slender to allow the heat to escape. All right, they will be more slender. And they won't be barrel shaped. They will be more like cylinder shaped, for example. Another example of environment that will shape body, and this again happens over thousands of years, will be peoples who lived in the Arctic, okay, areas of North America, the Eskimo, the Inuit, or Northern Asia, the Lapps and the Chukchi. And by the way, you will see the Chukchi when you watch the Journey of Man documentary, where the documentary filmmaker, the anthropologist, goes to the far north so that he can collect some blood samples. Okay, And that's what he does in that documentary. Um, Now, when we start to look at peoples who are different, and they look different, they don't they're not easily separated geographically. It's always in a rather of a continuum. All of a sudden, it's not going to be very clear cut, where body shape is often really clear cut, or skin color is very clear cut. No matter what human trait you're looking at, you're always going to tend to get it's always going to sort of scale off and feather off into that trait will show up in neighboring populations a little bit, and then less and less and less. Okay, when you map out traits, human traits like that, and when you see that those traits are sort of gradually distributed across the geographical surfaces, those are called clines, Clines, clines. And those genetic clines, or those variation clines, are what dominate human variation. Take skin color, for example. Uh, Skin color is also largely a product of the environment. Uh, Skin color became lighter 200,000 years ago. All Homo sapiens were dark skinned. But as Homo sapiens left Africa and got into colder climates, one of their problems that they had to deal with was a lack of vitamin D, because the sun was not as strong. And one adaptation to less strong sunlight was a skin color that would more readily absorb ultraviolet radiation in order to make vitamin D. Now, this vitamin D hypothesis is how we account for skin color being different in Homo sapiens. And so where the sun is weaker, then the skin will be lighter. Now, there's one major exception to this, and the other way in which Homo sapiens get vitamin D outside of standing in the sunlight and having ultraviolet rays go into your skin and create vitamin D is eating a lot of fresh seafood. Now, seafood is really high in vitamin D, and if your diet is full of seafood, you really don't need a lot of sunlight to create that vitamin D. And so when we go to, let's say, northern parts of Europe, northern parts of Asia, let's say like where you know central China is and central Europe is, you'll find lighter skinned peoples, okay? But when you go to the far, far north, like the Arctic peoples, okay, like the Inuit and the Eskimo and the Lapps, and the Chukchi, those people are actually darker skinned, because they're not getting out in the sunlight. They're still covered with clothes because it's Arctic weather, but they have a very high concentration of vitamin D in their diet. Okay, when you live in the Arctic, you're going to be eating either seafood or sea mammals, and you're going to largely think about eating them when they're not fairly raw. Okay, and their vitamin D content is even higher. So sometimes when you see maps about skin color, they show in the far Arctic north that the skin is lighter, and it's not. Okay. So the vitamin D hypothesis. Now, there's a couple other ways in which humans, vary, and that is adaptation to diseases, and and one of those is lactose intolerance. I know we often see that as a disease, but it can lead to a lot of gastrointestinal upset. Now, lactase intolerance, or lactose intolerance, that's when you don't have a lot of lactase. Your lactose intolerance means that you have not adapted to eating a lot of fresh milk. And that varies. There's no one geographical space where that varies. This is a great way in which to demonstrate what clines are. So when you see different populations that are lactose intolerant, that is, they get upset stomachs, there's some parts in Europe and there's some parts in Africa, and there's some parts in Asia. You get a lot of lactose intolerance in Asia because they don't have a culture of dairying. You have a culture of dairying in parts of Africa where you have a lot of cattle. You have a culture of dairying in Europe where they have a long history of dairying. But that will also be another way in which human populations differ. And the last one would be adaptation to malaria. Now, malaria is a consequence of the Neolithic Revolution, when people domesticated plants and animals. There was no such thing as malaria in Homo sapiens until people stayed in one spot and started to farm. And farming and agriculture creates a beautiful environment for mosquitoes. Okay, and mosquitoes carry this little bug called a trypanosome parasite. Okay, and those trypanosome parasites are injected into humans when they get bit by mosquitoes, and that's what causes malaria. Now, malaria, human populations in Africa, in West Africa, Central Africa, human populations throughout the Mediterranean, human populations on the certain parts of the Indian Ocean where Saudi Arabia and India and Pakistan are, had to adapt to malaria. And when they did, they created a gene that helped them resist having malaria symptoms. But if those genes became dominant in one's genotype, that's what caused malaria. Okay. In Africa, I'm sorry, that's what causes this. The malaria causes sickle cell anemia when you have a dominant gene for resisting malaria. Okay, and in Africa, it causes sickle cell anemia. Okay, in the Mediterranean areas, it causes pernicious anemia. Okay, and so you have sickle cell anemia in parts of Africa and in many parts of the Mediterranean. You get pernicious anemia, and similarly in parts of the Middle East and in far Western Asia, pernicious anemia is inherited. Okay, and so in a sense, there's a type of sickle cell anemia. It's not just Africans who get that. Other populations too that have had to adapt to the trypanosome parasite transmitted to humans by mosquitoes. Okay. Now, there's one other kind of microevolution that we want to talk about that has an impact on populations, and that's what is under the umbrella of what we call epigenetics, and that could absolutely have a huge impact on a population, having certain kinds of traits to it. And epigenetics are when one's genome is affected directly by the trauma or the stresses that one's parent, especially one's mother, goes through. And so the kind of stresses and trauma that happens with a mother can in fact affect the genome and the expression of the genome and the phenotype of offspring. And when you have an example, a classic example is PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, that when women who are giving birth to babies who are suffering from PTSD, some of those symptoms of stress could in fact express themselves in the offspring. Think about right now, if you looked at refugee camps that are spread throughout the world today. Here in 2024, you have huge refugee camps in Myanmar, who people who are being, in Bangladesh, for people who are being thrown out of Myanmar. You have refugee camps in Gaza, who are being relocated by the war in Gaza. You have refugee camps in the Sudan because there's a civil war going on there. There's refugee camps. in northern Nigeria now, because there are some 2 million people being displaced by flooding, have been thrown out of their homes. They're all over. Living in a refugee camp is extraordinarily stressful, if you can imagine, especially if you've lost a parent or a sibling, grieving and then being in a refugee camp. So imagine being in that kind of a situation, and you're in your 9th month of pregnancy, and then having to give birth. It's a very, very difficult situation, and the offspring often are affected by that, and that would be maybe an example of epigenetics. Okay, those are the main points on chapter 3, and hopefully you all have a good day, and maybe in the next lecture I'll be back in my office. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a great day.